spend the rest of the time talking about the criteria for IRB approval. This is actually one of my favorite things to talk about, so I'll probably be kind of animated about this. That's the module that we're talking about this week. And of course, what are the criteria for approval that we're talking about? Just as a basic reminder, there are, I know you can't read this in the back, the criteria that are listed in 111 of the regulations, things like the consent process, equitable selection of subjects, the risk-benefit relationship, and so on. And two of them, the consent process and consent documentation, each point to their own set of criteria about the consent process and consent documentation. There are other criteria for approval, things like the prisoner requirements and the pregnant women requirements, for example, but those are specific to certain kinds of research and studies. These are the requirements that are applied to all studies. These are the criteria for IRB approval. And what we're going to be focusing on this week is just the criteria at 111, because there are separate modules later on that focus on consent and the consent documentation. The really important point about these criteria is that they are not just regulatory criteria that we have to look at and check off of a list. They are the regulatory expression of the Belmont ethical principles. That's why they were created, and that is how they were created. They were founded on those ethical principles by a large group of people working on the ethical principles and trying to turn them into regulations. So a lot of really smart people, including ethicists, got together and figured out how to turn those ethical principles into regulations to govern human subjects research. So the principles give rise to the regulations at 45 CFR 46111, that's the HHS or OHRP regs, and 21 CFR 56, the FDA regs. And then those give rise to the IRB decisions. We decide to either approve or conditionally approve based on the criteria, or defer or disapprove based on those criteria. So in the module that was handed out for this, there is a table that looks something like this that lists the criteria for IRB approval and asks you as an action item to figure out which Belmont principle is the basis for each of the criteria. So that's what, if you haven't done that already, I encourage you to do that before Thursday. Oops, backwards here. Another important point about the criteria for approval is that they are both necessary and sufficient for granting IRB approval. So the IRB cannot grant approval unless all of these criteria are met. And the criteria are sufficient in that they contain what is necessary to protect subjects when they are systematically and rigorously applied. And that's an important caveat. So combined with those consent-related criteria and any other criteria that are specific to the research, like prisoners or kids or pregnant women, this should be sufficient to ensure that the research is ethical and compliant with the regs. Now, it's true that occasionally some institutions, and we're one of them, do add some of their own requirements on top of that. And we have a few, but they are ones that we try to put in writing so that we all know exactly what they are and are not. And one of them, for example, is that it is not a regulatory requirement for research to be minimal risk in order to qualify for exempt status. That's a requirement that we have added as an institution to the criteria for approval of exempt research. So, again, going back to the basics, a systematic assessment of these criteria assures us and the researchers and the IRBs and the institution that the research is ethical and it's approvable. That's why these are so important. They're at the foundation of what we do. If we look at ourselves from this required and ethical stance, what would we see? I think that's a really important thing to think about. In other IRBs, they don't necessarily do this. I shared this paper with the administrators meeting a few years ago when it first came out. And there are enough new people here now that I think it's worth going over this very important paper again to think about what it might mean for us. So this was a paper that was published by somebody in 2012. And basically what he did is he got permission to go in and audio record 2 IRB meetings at 10 different institutions that are just like us, large academic medical institutions. He got permission, he got IRB approval, and he went in and he recorded everything that they did in the meetings, and then he analyzed what they did and what they said and looked at it. And he focused on initial applications. The first thing that he did was to screen all of them to see whether or not each criterion was relevant to that specific initial application and whether it had already been adequately addressed in the application by the researcher. So when he did that, here's what he found. So he divided up the criteria slightly differently. He combined all of the consent things into one bucket. So basically, he found that risk minimization was adequately addressed in the IRB application, or didn't need to be addressed, in 21% of the applications. 79% of the application, they needed to discuss it. The IRB needed to discuss it. And all the way down to vulnerable subjects, 47% of the applications, no discussion was needed, either because there were no vulnerable subjects or because the application had adequately addressed all of the concerns. So that's sort of his initial triage, is just to see which applications really needed to have some kind of IRB discussion. So he took the ones where they needed a discussion, 104 initial applications, and now he looked at whether or not the IRB actually did discuss those criteria. He divided it into a couple of different buckets. One bucket was that the IRB did acceptably or adequately address the criteria, or they asked the researcher for some additional information or some changes in order to figure out if the criteria had been met. The other buckets were that the IRB mentioned the criteria, but they didn't actually come to any decision about whether or not the study met the criteria. And the last bucket was they didn't even mention the criteria, let alone talk about whether or not the study met the criteria. Now, I've ranked them on this table from the highest or the best case to the lowest case. So the highest one here, consent, 93% of the time the IRB discussed consent adequately to decide whether or not the consent criteria had been met by the study. But the ones here in red, less than half of the time the IRB adequately addressed the criterion for approval. So in the worst case, equitable selection, or the justice-based requirement, only 36% of the applications was there a discussion about equitable selection and a decision about whether or not the criterion had been met. So less than 50% of the time for 3 of the 7 criteria here. So a couple of interesting quotes from the authors. Although we could not listen to the audio recordings without appreciating the seriousness with which the reviewers took their responsibilities, we found that the IRBs frequently failed to discuss many of the human subjects protection criteria indicated and mandated by the common rule. The fact that they did not discuss these criteria raises questions about the effectiveness of the meetings to implement the ethical mandates of the common rule. I find this a very sobering study. And I think, could this be true of how expedited reviews are done as well? He didn't look at that. He only looked at full board reviews. But I would think that it would be even easier to sort of, if you're not using a checklist, maybe to remind you of what the criteria are, to perhaps overlook something. I don't know. And could this be true here? I'd like to think it isn't, but I think it's an important question for all of us to ask ourselves, especially as we get ready to make some changes in how we do things and to have new teams and some new approaches in our IRB reviews. So I'm going to pause there before I go on to a completely different topic. Does anybody have any thoughts or questions about this study?
How did you determine what warranted discussion? I mean, was that sort of his own opinion, or did he bounce that off other experts, or what?
Right. He had some people that he hired from one of the IRB offices at his place, and two of them did coding of the audio recordings. And then when they disagreed, I forget what their process was for coming to an agreement about that. So they had a couple of different coders about it, and they had a fairly low bar. The buckets. So acceptably addressed or questions or changed, all that the IRB had to do was to say the research has adequately addressed this criterion, or to say we don't think it's met this criteria until it's been changed in this way, or we can't decide whether or not it's met the criterion unless we have some additional information. So it was that simple.
In the slide before this one, where the sort of separating out even the ones, it sounds like in some cases the application itself captured enough information.
Mm-hmm.
Did the article discuss that in any more detail in terms of the adequacy of how IRBs collect that information up front?
No, not really. The whole focus of the study was really on these, where in their judgment, the application required discussion. For example, a lot of studies don't have vulnerable subjects, so they don't even need to talk about it in that case. Other questions, Dana?
So in that situation, based on the discussion, there are several of these that are around 50% of the applications needed to have those discussed outside of this application. So in some ways might have mapped a little bit onto the outcomes. Is that true, or am I misunderstanding?
I don't know. I could look at that. It's hard to tell. Yeah.
Right.
And one reason, it could be. One reason that 100% of the studies needed discussion on informed consent, because you have to have either an acceptable consent form or a waiver, so the IRB has to do something with it.
Right. And specifically thinking about equitable selection, since it's about 50-50, and then looking at the actual outcomes, how often equitable selection is discussed, IRB will not mention.
Yeah.
So like half of the cases maybe.
So the way that this works is that in 36%, only in 36% of this 50% that they talk about equitable selection.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah.
That was why I was just
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Other comments or questions? Okay. So I thought, given the results of this, that it would be worth it to spend just a little bit of time talking about that criterion of equitable selection of subjects, because this is the one that apparently IRBs tend to not talk about the most. The LIDS article that I just went over is not the only one that has found this. This is notorious for being the criterion that tends to be overlooked. So let's talk about a little bit what that means and why maybe it's being overlooked. So here's a statement from somebody, I forget, it wasn't Lids, it was somebody else I was reading a couple weeks ago, who said that IRBs tend to often virtually ignore the justice principle. One of the three principles that we're supposed to apply. And in the study I just mentioned to you, it was adequately addressed in only 36% of the studies, and it wasn't even mentioned at all in 60% of the studies where they thought it should have been mentioned. So that's kind of sobering. So what does this all mean? So any of you who've looked at an NIH grant application or who've maybe participated in preparing one have seen tables that look something like this. They changed a little bit over the years, but basically they have tables where they require the PI to specify how many subjects they expect to enroll in these different gender, ethnic, and racial categories. So male, female, Hispanic or not Hispanic, and then the racial categories. NIH has been pretty rigorous about enforcing appropriate selection based on this kind of characterization and the population where the study is going to occur. So if you do this, does that mean you're all okay with equitable selection and you don't have to worry about it? Anybody want to take a stab at that?
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily. What would be a reason why it wouldn't be enough to deal with equitable
Or it
selection?
might be too much. I mean, it's not enough information. There might be a reason why the study is targeting specific populations or specific cells in that table.
Mm-hmm.
And the regulation is not that there must be totally equal representation, but just that there be a valid reason why there is not. And also
Right.
then what is your denominator for determining what's equitable?
Right. But this is something that NIH requires, and the original basis for it is that they wanted to ensure equitable selection. And that means that the burdens and the benefits of the research are fairly distributed. So there isn't a single group that is going and assuming all the risks of being in the research, but a different group is the one that's getting most of the benefit from it. So they are concerned, as are the regulatory agencies, about whether subjects are being selected just because they're easily available, or because they're very manipulable, or they have some kind of compromised position that makes them more vulnerable to being enrolled in a study, rather than for reasons that are directly related to the problem being studied in the research. So that's the concern, making sure that the benefits and the burdens are being fairly distributed. So can anybody think of some examples of what might be an inequitable selection, or historically some inequitable selection of subjects? Heidi? Tuskegee. Right, exactly. African Americans were the ones who were enrolled in that study and took on all the risks of having untreated syphilis even after penicillin was developed. And they did not benefit at all from the information that was gathered from that study, nor did other African Americans, because they didn't have as much access to health care and health insurance. Emily?
And I think it's a lot less dramatic for me than college students.
College students, right. College students are very easily available to most researchers, aren't they? The psych subject pool, the survey day. Deborah?
Caucasian, drug trials, without getting enough people of other ethnicities and races, when it's known that there are racial differences in reactions or
Right.
benefits or risks to different kinds of drugs.
That's a great example. In fact, I heard of a brand new specific example of that just this morning when I was at the Hutch that I didn't know. Apparently, systemic lupus is 3 times more likely to occur in populations that have an African background than in a European background. And yet all of the research pretty much is done on European background, on Caucasian populations in terms of treatments and understanding lupus. So that's another example of a disparity between the benefits and the burden. Any other examples? Jason?
Sometimes like in phase 1 patient research, it's supposed to require a long amount of time. It's often people, sometimes I've seen the predominant people who are homeless, or they also pay a lot too. People who have needed money will sign up more, but the benefits of that study obviously go beyond those particular
Right.
economic groups.
Yeah, that's a great example also. So there are lots of examples for why this principle is important and it shouldn't be ignored. Some of the examples continue even today. There's a lot of controversy about things. Here's a couple of other examples for some of you who might have been, I think it was at one of the WIRB conferences a couple years ago. One of the keynote speakers was somebody who had written a book, a really interesting book about all the dermatology experiments that occurred in the Harrisburg prison in Pennsylvania back in the 60s and 70s. And he had one of the prisoners there who had gone through a bunch of those experiments. It was a very moving thing, and that was because they were available they could get privileges by participating in this research, but boy, they did not benefit from that research. Many international drug trials are criticized because they are being done on a population that is not going to benefit. This was especially true for some of the early HIV/AIDS drug trials. Cardiovascular research was criticized for a long time because it was all done on men, and yet women experienced cardiovascular disease to the same degree, and everybody knew that they didn't react the same way to some of the drugs, but all the research was on men. And the Hopkins lead exposure study is another example that's been criticized because it was being done on people who were living in situations where they had to stay in these houses that had lots of lead, but they were not going to benefit from the outcomes of the study that showed how lead exposure could be managed. So lots of examples and important criteria. Now, how do we apply this criterion? The OHRP IRB handbook is, although it's archived, it still has some things in it that are really useful. One of the things that's really useful is that they provide some points to consider for each one of these criteria for approval. Those are printed on the last 2 pages of the chapter for you to read. Now, there's a flip side to looking at all of the criteria for approval, and especially for this one. There is a risk about equitable selection. Can anybody guess what that might be from this slide? Overprotection of a vulnerable population. I love this picture. So OHRP says investigators and IRBs must be careful not to overprotect vulnerable populations so that they are excluded from participating in research which they might wish to participate in, particularly when the research involves therapies for which there are no available treatments or for serious or poorly misunderstood conditions. So that's the balance that the IRBs have to weigh, is overprotection versus protection when it comes to equitable selection. There's this fundamental tension between protection and access to research. So if we look at this again, this NIH table that's required for pretty much every single human subjects grant that NIH funds, how can we look at it now from the standpoint of equitable selection? Well, this was all based on basically the cardiovascular research that was done in the 50s and 60s. And when it became so clear that women had been excluded from this research, what happened was NIH started making these requirements, and they started the Women's Health Initiative, which is a $100 million study that's still going on today. So the purpose of this was to create some balance between the burdens and the benefits of drug clinical trials across groups that were known to differ in their responses to things and where we needed that information. So this table does have some usefulness in terms of equitable selection. It's appropriate for most clinical trials, but it's not necessarily sufficient to secure equitable selection in all research. And that's why we don't have that table on our IRB application, although many other institutions do. It's because that is not enough, especially for the array of research that we do, to make sure that we have justice in our studies. Again, OHRP, these requirements are often implemented with a rigid numerical approach without regard to the underlying ethical principle involved. So what about equitable selection and minimal risk research? That's so much of what we do. And how do you apply that there? Well, we do have to apply it. It is a required criterion for approval. But in minimal risk research, the burdens, that is the risks of the research, are so much lower than for clinical trials, and the benefits are also. So they're much less likely to be unfairly distributed because they're so minimal in a population. So yes, we have to consider it, but not to the same degree necessarily that we need to with full board research. The bar is quite a bit lower there. So, the criteria for approval. This is the fundamental heart of what we do and what the IRBs need to do. So those 8 criteria, as listed in the regulations, or 7 in the LIDS article, are really critical. It's really important to pay attention to those. So I hope you'll read the module that was handed out, and then in the study sessions, we have a couple of different things that we'll be doing. We'll be handing those out later today. We have an actual IRB letter that came out of this office many years ago. It's been anonymized. And we're going to go through it and decide how many of the, I think it's 17 points are actually related to a criteria for approval, and then talk a little bit more about the criteria. Any questions? Okay, thank you.